two strangers on two continents, gave the same simple DNA test, and what came back broke open 400 years of silence. The truth did not just show where their families came from. It showed what was done to them. Two people spit into two identical tubes. One was born in Atlanta. The other was born in Lagos. They had never met, never shared a meal, and never spoken to each other. On paper, they were strangers, divided by an ocean and 400 years of history. But when the results came back, the lab found something many people in this story would rather avoid. The man from Atlanta had spent his whole life being told his family came from somewhere in Africa. The test showed the exact genetic signature of a people living less than 200 miles from where the man from Lagos was born. In the most basic biological sense, they were cousins. And that was only the start of what the DNA showed. For years, the question of how Black Americans and continental Africans truly relate to each other has been buried under politics, pride, and pain. Everyone had an opinion. Almost no one had proof. Now, for the first time, the genome gave an answer. And it was not the answer either side expected. To understand why this test caused such a reaction, you have to understand the argument it walked into. For as long as anyone can remember, there has been a quiet tension between Black Americans and the Africans their ancestors were taken from. You see it in comment sections. You hear it at family gatherings. You feel it in jokes that are not really jokes. Some Africans look at Black Americans and say they are not truly African anymore. Too much was lost. The language is gone. The names are gone. The homeland is gone. And some Black Americans look back across the ocean and feel a door that closed on them long ago. A continent that feels like home and like a stranger at the same time. Both sides are carrying something real. One group was scattered, renamed, and told to forget. The other stayed, kept the languages, borders, and traditions, and watched relatives vanish onto ships that never came back. For centuries later, their descendants meet online and argue about who belongs to whom. It became one of the most emotional debates in the Black world, and almost none of it was built on evidence. It was built on feeling, memory, and wounds. Then science caught up. In the last 15 years, genetic testing went from a lab curiosity to something millions of normal people could do from home. And when hundreds of thousands of Black Americans finally spit into those tubes, researchers suddenly had something no historian ever had. A record that could not be edited, burned, or rewritten. The human genome does not care about politics. It does not care about pride. It just remembers. And what it remembered was about to settle an argument that words never could. Here is what makes this story so strange. The people most sure they already knew the answer were the ones the DNA shocked the most. Black Americans who thought their roots had been erased beyond recovery. Africans who thought the link had been watered down into nothing. Commentators who built whole careers on the idea that these were now two separate peoples. All of them were about to be corrected by their own bodies. And the correction went in a direction almost nobody expected. It did not prove the two groups were strangers. It did not prove one was more African than the other. It proved something that made many people uncomfortable for reasons that had nothing to do with science. Because inside that genetic data was not just a map of where Black Americans came from. There was also a confession, a record written in DNA itself of what happened on those plantations, who survived, who did not, and what was done to the people who did. And settling that matters far more than family curiosity. For millions of people, this is the difference between having a history and having a blank. Most Americans can name the country their family sailed from, the town, sometimes even the street they can visit. They can follow a line through birth records, church books, and ship lists until the names finally run out. For the descendants of the enslaved, that line hits a wall almost at once. A wall built on purpose. The records stop at a first name and a price. Beyond that, nothing. Or so everyone believed. What the genome offered was a way around that wall. A second set of records the traders never knew they were keeping and never had the power to destroy. We are going to walk through all of it, where the ancestors really came from, down to specific regions and peoples. what the European ancestry in Black American DNA really means, and why it is one of the hardest parts of this whole story, and the single finding that, once you see it, you cannot unsee. But to get there, you first have to understand how a tube of spit can reach back 400 years and name the dead. I have to stop here for a second because there's always a point in these videos where the research goes farther than I can fit into one video. The full picture, the full science, everything DNA has revealed that does not fit into 20 minutes. I put all of it in one place. The QR code is on your screen right now. Pause the video. Point your phone at it. Get it? Before we keep going, start with what a DNA test is really doing, because it is not magic and it is not guesswork. Every human carries 3 billion letters of genetic code, and almost all of it is the same from person to person. We are all more than 99% alike, but spread through that code are millions of tiny spots where people differ. Single letters that change from one person to the next. On their own, those changes mean nothing, but together, they form patterns. And those patterns tend to cluster by geography. Because, for most of human history, people had children with people who lived near them. Over thousands of years, groups in the same place built their own signature mixes of these markers. The peoples of West Africa carried patterns slightly different from the peoples of Central Africa, who differed again from the peoples of Europe or Asia. None of this makes anyone better or worse. It is just the fingerprint of geography, the mark left by who lived where and married whom across many generations. To read someone's ancestry, scientists compare that person's markers with reference panels. These are large collections of DNA from people whose families have lived in one place for generations. When they built panels using populations across Africa, Europe, and the Americas, they could take one Black American genome and break it apart piece by piece. This segment matches West Africa. This segment matches Northern Europe. This small piece matches a Native American population. They were not guessing. They were matching the code to the living descendants of the people who wrote it. And when they did this, on hundreds of thousands of African Americans, a clear picture appeared. On average, a Black American in the United States carries about 73 to 80% African ancestry. The rest is mostly European, usually around 20 to 24%. There is also a small and often overstated sliver of Native American ancestry that, for most people, turns out to be tiny or missing. Those are averages and people vary a lot. Some get results that show over 90% African ancestry. Others, to their shock, find the European share is much larger than any family story ever suggested. But the averages hide the bigger finding. What matters more is where that African ancestry points. This is the part the slave trade was designed to erase. When a person was taken from home, chained, shipped across the ocean, and sold, one of the first things stripped away was origin. Their name was replaced. Their language was forbidden. Their nation, village, and people were erased. All of it was flattened into one empty label, with no past and no map. The whole system depended on making sure the descendants would never point to a place and say, "That is where I come from." The genome undid that in a single generation of testing, because the African part of Black American DNA does not point vaguely to a continent. It points with real force to a specific band of West and Central Africa. The ancestry clusters heavily along the coast and interior of what is now Senegal, Gambia, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Ivory Coast, Ghana, Togo, Benin, and Nigeria. Then it stretches down into Cameroon, Gabon, Congo, and Angola. That arc is not random. It almost perfectly traces the coastline of the transatlantic slave trade. The DNA is a map of the crime, and within that arc, some places glow much brighter than others. Nigeria appears again and again in African American results, far more often than old shipping records alone would predict. The same is true for the Congo and Angola region. There is a reason the genetics do not match the old paperwork, and that reason is one of the darkest threads in this whole story. We will get to it in a moment. But first, sit with how strange and deep this already is. A people who were told they had no homeland were just handed back the coordinates. Not by a historian. Not by a government. By their own blood. Think about what that means for one family. A woman in Houston grows up with a last name given to the people who once owned her ancestors. She has no village, no oral history that survived, no thread tying her to anything older than a plantation record. She spits in a tube. Weeks later, a screen tells her that a large share of her ancestry traces to the Bight of Biafra, to peoples like the Igbo of southeastern Nigeria. For the first time in her family's American life, which means for the first time in centuries, someone can point across the ocean and name a people. That is not entertainment. That is a welded door being forced back open. Now, a fair question. If the DNA is this precise, why did it take so long? And why is it still imperfect? Part of the answer is that Africa is the most genetically diverse continent on Earth. Humanity began there. That means African populations hold more genetic variation than the whole rest of the world combined. Reading that well requires huge reference data from African populations themselves. And for a long time, those populations were the least studied and least funded in all of genetics. The early tests could only tell you West African versus East African. There is one more tool that turns ancestry testing into something closer to a witness. Inside your cells are two pieces of DNA that move through time in a very special way. The first is mitochondrial DNA. A mother passes it to all her children, but only her daughters pass it on again. Follow it back, and you trace a pure line of mothers, mother to mother to mother, deep into the past. The second is the Y chromosome. A father passes it only to his sons. Follow that back, and you trace a pure line of fathers. Between the two, scientists can read the mother's side and the father's side of a family tree separately, like two ropes twisted into one cord. Normally, those two lines tell roughly the same story, because people usually have children with others from their own region. But when a population has lived through something violent and unnatural, the two ropes split apart. The mother's line starts telling one story. The father's line starts telling another. When researchers separated those two lines in the DNA of the African diaspora, the gap between them was huge. And that gap is a fingerprint pointing straight at what was done. The other part of the answer is more painful. The clearer the picture got, the more it started revealing things that were never meant to be revealed. Because ancestry testing does not only tell you where your people came from, it also records, in cold numbers, what happened to them after they arrived. And that is where this stops being a feel-good reunion story and turns into something many people on every side of this debate would rather not face. Before we go farther, look at the code on your screen. What I just described is only one part of something much bigger. Every discovery covered here has a deeper layer under it. That document is that layer. The full DNA evidence. Everything the research really found. Scan it with your phone. Take 10 seconds. Then come back. To see it, you have to compare two sets of numbers. The first set is the historical record of the slave trade itself. The ledgers, manifests, and port logs that European traders kept with horrifying care. Those records tell us that of the roughly 12.5 million Africans forced onto ships, most were men. Traders preferred men for the brutal labor of fields and mines. The shipping records show that clearly. If genetics simply mirrored who boarded the ships, you would expect African ancestry in the Americas to lean heavily male. The second set of numbers comes from the genome. And this is where the story breaks. When researchers measured African ancestry passed down through maternal lines against African ancestry passed down through paternal lines, the balance was wrong. Badly wrong. Across the Americas, the African contribution to the modern gene pool came overwhelmingly from women. Even though far more men had been shipped, a population that arrived mostly male somehow left descendants whose African ancestry was mostly female. Those two facts cannot both be innocent. One of them needs an explanation, and the explanation is exactly what you think it is. The explanation is sexual violence on such a vast scale that it left a permanent mark on the DNA of an entire hemisphere. Enslaved men were worked to death in huge numbers, often before they had children. They were also often blocked from forming families at all. Enslaved women, by contrast, were raped by the men who owned them again and again across generations. The children of those assaults were born into slavery and raised as property. That is why the African maternal line runs so strong while the African paternal line grows thin. And it is the same reason European ancestry exists in Black Americans at all. That 20% or so of European DNA is not mostly a story of romance or partnership. In the great majority of cases, it entered the family tree through a white man and an enslaved woman who could not refuse. When a Black American opens their results and sees a quarter of their ancestry traced to Britain or Ireland, they are not looking at a heritage. They are looking at a record of what was done to their great-great-grandmothers. This is the part the DNA admitted that no ledger ever would. The manifests recorded the cargo. The genome recorded the crime that happened after the cargo was unloaded. And it also clears up the earlier mystery, the one about Nigeria and Congo shining brighter than the shipping records predict. Survival was not spread evenly. The people whose descendants live today are not a neat sample of everyone who was taken. They are the ones who lived long enough to have children, who lived long enough to have children of their own. Some regions, some arrivals, and some conditions produced far more surviving lineages than others. The genome is not a picture of who was stolen. It is a picture of who endured. Every living Black American is descended very specifically from the people who did not die. That is a staggering thing to carry. It helps to step back and see the full scale, because the numbers are hard to hold in your head. Over about 350 years, historians estimate that around 12.5 million Africans were forced onto slave ships. Close to 2 million died during the Middle Passage itself. Their bodies were thrown into the same ocean. Their descendants would one day cross in the other direction to find them. Of the survivors, only a small fraction, a few 100,000, were brought directly to what became the United States. Most were taken to the Caribbean and Brazil, where conditions were so deadly that enslaved populations often could not sustain their own numbers without a steady flow of new arrivals. That one fact changes how you read the DNA of the Americas. In the United States, the enslaved population eventually grew more through birth than importation. That is part of why African American ancestry, though drawn from many peoples, settled into a fairly consistent pattern. In much of Latin America and the Caribbean, the genetic picture is different again, shaped by different origins, timelines, and horrors. The point is simple. There is no single story of the African diaspora. There are many, and each is written in the DNA of the people who came out the other side. Now let's go back across the ocean, because this is where the argument that started this whole video finally gets its answer. When you sharpen the African ancestry of Black Americans down to specific peoples, familiar names appear again and again. The Yoruba and the Igbo of Nigeria, the Mende and Temne of Sierra Leone, the Akan of Ghana, the Congo and Bundu peoples of Central Africa, the Fan and Yu of the Old Bight of Benin. These are not rare or scattered matches. They are the same peoples who still fill cities and villages across West and Central Africa today. Tens of millions of living people who share deep, recent, traceable ancestry with the descendants of the enslaved. So when an African says a Black American is not really African, the DNA answers plainly. Yes, they are. Not in some weak, symbolic way. In the same measurable sense that a Yoruba person in Lagos is African. The ancestry is right there, specific and undeniable. But the DNA also answers the other way. And this is the part Black Americans sometimes do not expect. No African American is simply Yoruba or simply Congo or simply Mende. They are a blend of many African peoples who, back in Africa, would rarely have mixed at all. Slavery threw together peoples who had lived hundreds of miles apart, spoke different languages, and had separate histories. Their descendants now carry all of them at once. That blending created something truly new. Black Americans are not a lost branch of any one African nation. They are a people who came into being in the Americas, built from pieces of many African societies and marked by 4 centuries in a new and hostile land. There is no population anywhere in Africa that matches them exactly, because the thing that made them was the crossing itself. That is why the reunion is real, but complicated. An African American who visits Ghana or Nigeria is coming home and arriving somewhere new at the same time. Both feelings are true. The DNA supports both. And this is where the cultural argument and the genetic truth finally split apart. Culturally, the distance is real. Languages were lost. Foods changed. Names were replaced. A Black American and a Nigerian can meet and feel the gap of 400 years in the first 5 minutes of talking. That gap is not fake, and pretending it away helps no one. But under the culture, in the code that culture cannot touch, the relationship is not distant at all. It is the relationship of cousins separated by one catastrophe. The DNA does not see a foreigner and a native. It sees families split apart and only now finding its way back to the same table. There is a bitter irony under all of this. In the United States, the law once said that a single drop of African blood made a person black. That rule was designed to keep the enslaved and their descendants locked in place, no matter how much European ancestry had been forced into the family tree. That same rule, made as a tool of control, accidentally preserved an identity. It bound together everyone of African descent into one people. And that people built a culture, a language, a music, and a strength that reshaped the world. African American identity was forged inside the very machine that was supposed to erase African identity altogether. The DNA now shows both truths at once. The ancestry that rule claimed to see really is there. And the fullness of who these people became is far bigger than any single drop. That is why the results can hit so hard. A Black American looking at an ancestry breakdown is not just reading a pie chart. They are seeing the outline of a family that was never allowed to keep its own records. Every percentage is a person who survived something unimaginable. The African part is the homeland that was stolen. The European part is, far too often, the violence that stole it. And the simple fact that the person exists to take the test at all is proof that somewhere in that chain, against terrible odds, their ancestors held on. Held on long enough for the record to survive. Held on long enough for someone generations later to read it back and speak the names aloud. You can watch this happen in real time now. There are people whose whole work is using DNA to match African Americans with living African relatives. And the reunions are almost too painful to watch. A man from South Carolina meets a family in Cameroon who share his exact genetic markers. And within an hour, they are calling him brother. Not as a metaphor, but because that is what the science says he is. A woman from Louisiana is welcomed into a village in Sierra Leone by people who trace their line to the same small coastal region hers was taken from. These are not symbolic ceremonies made for a camera. They are biological facts being lived out by people who were never supposed to find each other again. The slave trade was built on a bet. The bet was that if you scatter a people far enough, strip their names, forbid their languages, and mix them beyond recognition, the connection will die and never be rebuilt. For a long time, that bet looked like it had worked. The descendants could feel the absence, but they could not prove the presence. There was longing, but no address. The system had done its job. The genome is proof that the bet failed. Everything the traders tried to erase, they only managed to hide. And they hid it imperfectly. The names of the people survived inside the cells of the stolen. The map of the homeland survived. Even the record of the violence survived so completely that we can now measure it. 400 years of forced forgetting, undone by a tube of spit and a reference panel. That is the thing no one on any side of this argument fully wanted to admit. Not just that Black Americans and Africans are the same. Not just that they are different. But that the wound between them was inflicted, not natural. It was done to them. It was never who they were. What makes this moment different from any before it is that the science is finally being built by the people it describes. For most of the history of genetics, African populations were an afterthought, understudied and underfunded. That meant ancestry tools were sharpest for Europeans and blurriest for the very people whose history most needed to be recovered. That is changing. Large research efforts are now sequencing African populations in detail for the first time, led in important part by African and African American scientists who understand exactly what is at stake. Every new reference population added is another set of names returned, another region brought into focus, another family given the chance to point across the ocean and say, there. So the next time you see the argument flare up online, the one about who is really African and who lost the right to claim it, remember what the DNA actually said. It did not pick a side. It did something better. It named the dead, drew the map back, exposed the crime, and pointed both groups to the very same ancestors. The people who were meant to forget each other are learning each other's names again. And the science that made it possible is only getting sharper. Which means the reunions you are seeing now are not the end of this story. They are only the beginning of a much longer one. The DNA did not erase the wound. It proved where it came from and who was torn apart. The names are coming back now. Subscribe so you do not miss the next one.